Good evening. The clean green image of New Zealand is supposedly under threat. Our dirty rivers and lakes, according to the Greens, but the government says new measures will help clean up the country's fresh water. Environment Minister Amy Adams joins me tonight, and Lynched starts right now. Good evening, thanks for joining us. Well, the government has announced national standards for fresh water with the introduction of minimum requirements to ensure water quality is suitable for the ecosystem and for human health. But the Greens argue the standards fall well short of what's needed and won't ensure rivers will be we can swim in them. That's the bad part, they say. The government says, though, the standards balance economic growth and environmental sustainability. So what does all this actually mean? To discuss this is Environment Minister Amy Adams. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Chris.
Last week you announced policy over fresh water quality, but the Greens say this falls well short of anything. It still means that you can't actually swim in some of our most polluted rivers in New Zealand. Is there truth to that statement? Because that still sounds concerning.
Well, let's first of all start with a little bit of context. The vast majority of the rivers and lakes in New Zealand are very healthy and very clean, but there's no doubt that there are some where there is deterioration and we've got an issue, so we do have to deal with those. What we've got at the moment is a framework that says that there are no rules nationally and it's up to councils alone to decide what their water quality targets are. What we've announced is to say, actually, we're going to set a minimum bottom line threshold that councils cannot choose to go below. So that's a brand new requirement, it's a big step forward from what we have.
So what are those minimum requirements then? What does it say?
Sure. So what it says, first of all, is that councils have to manage all their water bodies for ecosystem health and for human health at a minimum, and then they can also choose to manage it for other things like swimming or mahinga kai or irrigation or any of the other uses that the community might have. So what happens, of course, at the moment, as I said, there's no rules. We're putting in place the minimum. Now, the Green Party have come out and said, actually, they want the minimum bottom line to be the gold standard. We're not saying that that is the aspirational final goal. We're saying that this is the bare minimum that is considered acceptable. Now, what happens, of course, is whenever you move that standard up, it means more cost on communities. So it might mean ratepayers have to pay for a new wastewater treatment system. It might mean some business can't go ahead or has to dial back and people lose jobs. So you've got to be really careful that we're addressing water quality where it's needed.
Is the gold standard, though, for the government at the moment, swimmable rivers? Is that what you're saying? So
the gold standard and the aspiration is something that each community works through. So if you think about it in your community, would you ask that every single stormwater drainage canal out the back of a subdivision should be made fit for swimming? Now, I would suggest that that's would be a nonsense in cost. And actually, certainly we need to manage popular swimming spots and lakes and rivers for swimming. And that's what I would expect my community and my council would want. But I'm not going to sit in Wellington and dictate that every single drop of water in every drainage canal and every waterways should be swimmable. That's just not sensible. But where they are being used for swimming, absolutely they need to be made swimmable.
Do you think New Zealand's so-called 100% pure image, is that a true representation, given that we do have rivers and lakes in New Zealand that fall well below, even now, the minimum standards that you've just introduced?
Look, there are some. They're certainly not the majority of sites. Actually, the majority of lakes and rivers in New Zealand are very, very clean. Yes, there are some areas of concern, but internationally, on a world scale, we are still one of the cleanest, greenest, most beautiful countries in the world, and I think it is a brand that we can own proudly. Unfortunately, though, there's a couple of people around, and the Green Party and their supporters amongst them, who like to come out and badmouth New Zealand's water quality standard for their own political gain. So, for example, last week we had a lot of criticism being made that the nitrogen level in our bottom line would made it worse than the Yangtze River, which is just completely nonsense. The Yangtze, yes, it's very polluted. It's not polluted with nitrogen. So they're deliberately using a river that people know as being polluted and using that as a comparable source for nitrogen. And nitrogen isn't the pollution, so they're twisting the information as best they can to sort of sell New Zealand down the river, if you pardon the pun, and paint a really bad picture. And I just think that's appalling. You
talk of, though, the environmental and the commercial imperatives, that fine balancing act, though. Do you really believe, though, we could potentially lose jobs by increasing the freshwater quality in New Zealand? I don't understand how that can possibly make sense, Minister.
Well, if you look at the job stats, and I put out a document last week that goes through and just highlights some of the huge number of people who are employed in sectors that rely on fresh water, whether it's in dairy, arable, horticulture, tourism, power generation. The reality is if the standards move too far and too fast so that technology can't adapt and keep up with them, businesses will have to close, people will lose jobs. So absolutely New Zealanders want clean water, and I support them 100% in that. But I think what we have to do is make sure that those freshwater targets are in keeping with all of the community's expectations, including being able to have a job and feed their family. My absolute belief is that New Zealand farming, New Zealand business, New Zealand urban sites can adapt and can improve their effect on our water bodies, but that will take some time and it has to be balanced out over a number of years. If we think we can turn off the tap magically overnight tomorrow, make everything perfect, one, we're dreaming, it's just not physically possible in terms of the lag, and two, we would devastate the New Zealand economy. And actually I think people do care about their ability to have a job and feed their family, so they want to see this done in a moderate, sensible time
Give
frame.
me some examples though. When you say businesses could actually go under if we try and increase the standards too high, what do you mean? Like what businesses? Can you give me some examples?
Sure. Well, if you take, so a really topical one at the moment obviously is dairy farming, because this is one that obviously is discussed a lot. It isn't by any means the whole of the problem. They are a part of the problem, but they're not all of it. If we were to set nitrogen, what they call nitrogen leaching targets, which is how much nitrogen or phosphorus can drop out of the bottom of the soil underneath the dairy farm, if we were to set that at a level that is so low they're not able to farm there, they have no option but to cease farming there. So somehow we have to gradually minimise that environmental footprint at a rate that technology and innovation and new farming practices can keep up. We're already seeing it.
But the trouble is the technology, even though it's there, at the moment though, what you're saying essentially it's too expensive.
No, not necessarily, but it does mean there's a change in farming systems. They may have to build on-farm infrastructure, they may have to think differently about cow genetics. All of that is in process, but it's not something that gets flicked as a switch overnight, and even if you do, it takes a lag time to flow through the waterways. So we're all about improving freshwater quality, but what we're about saying is that there is a national minimum that we're going to expect from Wellington. Beyond that, it's for communities to work through in each case for their own water bodies, how far and how fast they can move and for what purposes.
Has this been overcooked by the Greens, this freshwater quality issue? I mean, having said what the Greens are saying, what National says, we still should be able to swim in our lakes and rivers in New Zealand. Do you accept that though?
I would like my children to be able to swim in the lakes and rivers around where we live and where I've grown up. It's what I grew up wanting to do, and I think that makes perfect sense. What I don't accept is that there should be a national mandate that every drop of water and every drainage channel and every waterway should be fit for swimming. That's not what we expect, and if I was to set a blanket rule from Wellington, that would pick up every single circumstance. So what we've done and said, there is a minimum standard that every waterway should meet. Beyond that, each community will identify this is a swimming spot, this is where our kids want to play, we want those managed to this top standard, and our framework allows them to do that. One
river causing concern, of course, is the Waimakariri River. We'll discuss those issues a little bit later on the show. And also a couple of other Christchurch farms in the news recently for all the wrong environmental reasons. That's next. Stay with us. Welcome back to Lynched. Environment Minister Amy Adams is my guest. Amy, I saw on television a couple of nights ago and it really infuriated me seeing Environment Canterbury officers out and about around the streets of Christchurch with the little wee radar things pointing out at chimneys and putting little wee notices in letterbox saying naughty, naughty. And I thought to myself, get a life. I really did. I thought, if we're still living in a broken city, then surely there still needs to be a fine balancing act of providing a home that's warm and dry, where homes can be heated with, the earthquake-related issues.
Yeah.
Yet we've got Environment Canterbury officers with their infrared sensors. I just thought, oh, really? What do you see in that?
So it is a balance, and I think that's the critical thing. And what this is about is, first and foremost, people have to be warm. I expect every Cantabrian to be able to keep themselves warm. And you're right, there are some people who are still living in broken homes and trying to work through that whole earthquake repair process, and we do have to be able to cut them some slack and help them out. But the other side of the story is that 1,000 people a year die from air pollution-related illnesses, so early death brought on by air pollution.
Really? Where are those stats from?
So there's quite, because I asked the same question, I said, really? Come on, that can't be right.
Yeah.
But actually they're quite high-powered health research that goes into it. And actually the good news is that the number's dropping. and our population's growing, so we're seeing some improvement. But at 1,000 people dying a year, you think of the effort we put into the road toll for 200 or 300. This stuff does matter, so we do have to improve air quality. I don't think anyone wants the Christchurch smog of old, but it is about that balance. So those of us who are in more modern homes or are rebuilding homes, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, look, think about clean heat. But for those people who are still waiting for repairs or living with difficult circumstances, absolutely, it's about balance.
Clarify the regulations. At the moment, if I build a new home in Christchurch, I cannot install a log burner at all. Is that right?
No, look, my understanding, and I've got to point out that the government doesn't set those rules. We set a compliance target.
Local authorities do, yeah.
Yeah, the regional council does. So my understanding is at the moment you can put in a complying fresh air or clean air burning log burner, but they're considering changing that to say none at all.
That's right, because of government regulations.
No.
It suggests you can only have 3 high polluting days per year or something like that.
That's right. So we say how many exceedance days they should be aiming for by 2016, and actually that's about the World Health Standard and keeping people safe. ECAN decides how it's going to meet those rules. So the government log burner standards say it's perfectly okay to have a log burner as long as it emits no more than 1.5 gram of emission per kilo of wood burnt, so it's a very, very low level. So we've said that's fine, but ECAN, of course, can choose to have stronger rules than that. So what I guess I'd like to see happen is absolutely we continue educating people about burning, the importance of burning good dry wood and burning it well and burning it at a good high heat.
See, I'm
but I don't want to see
surprised about
anyone
that.
have their heat turned off if that's their only source of heat.
Well, could that possibly happen though?
Well,
because Environment Canterbury is putting letters and letterboxes saying, please explain notices.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I think they have to be careful to work through and understand the circumstances in each case. But certainly if people are building brand new homes, then that's the time to be putting in good, healthy, clean burning technology. For me, it's not actually about the type of heating, it's about the emissions. So if you can get a good clean burning log burner, and they do exist, and use good dry wood, that shouldn't create too much of an issue.
Do you
if you're
think
not
it's a bit
burning
weird
good wood,
though
it
that
does.
ECAN is encouraging people to dob in their neighbours?
Yeah, I don't think that creates the sort of the community spirit we want, but I guess what they're focusing on is that if the air pollution exists, we all suffer. So we've all got a stake in seeing it improve. But I do think we have to keep the human side of this in focus, and particularly, as you say, in Christchurch, we've got our own special challenges. 3 years on, some of us still haven't had home repairs.
A stat I want to bring up
look
on
after them.
is the government was criticised for replacing 362 log burners in state houses with new compliant log burners instead of what the Greens will probably say upgrading to clean forms of heating. So in a way though, doesn't this go against what the government and the local authorities are trying to achieve?
No, because as I said, the government standard says that log burners are acceptable if they're clean burning log burners, and that is available to all landowners at the moment. So Housing New Zealand has to go through the same compliance with ECAN rules that any other homeowner does. So the log burners that Housing New Zealand have put in are the same log burners that any other homeowner can put in. Now the Greens will always say you should be doing more, but actually, as I say, ECAN makes the decisions around what works, what don't. But it is important that we do see an improvement in air pollution in Christchurch. I think everyone would agree with that. It's about going about it in the right way.
Fracking.
Yeah.
This is potentially a big issue. It's very polarising, much like log burners. You had quite an interesting, don't you reckon? An independent environment watchdog is calling for tighter regulations governing, fracking. And I was really surprised that Dr. Jan Wright, the Commissioner for the Environment, that offers you advice, says you've got to tighten up the rules regarding this.
Yeah.
And the latest statement you made publicly was, we'll have a look at it, we'll take the advice. But it was pretty strong stuff saying...
No, she didn't quite say that. So she did an interim report, I think that came out earlier last year, that called for, first of all, some clarity around the rules and regulations.
She's concerned about the potential for rapid expansion
That's
in
right.
North Island's east coast.
But what she said was that actually there's no call or no need to call for a moratorium, and you'll remember the Greens and others were screaming that it should all be banned and there should be a complete halt, and she found actually there's no need for that. She found that there's no suggestion that the current framework hasn't worked well where it's been done, but what she said is actually, if we look overseas, this could expand potentially rapidly into other parts of New Zealand, and she thought that it was important that we got ahead of that and worked out what different regulatory frameworks might be needed in different parts of New Zealand. So it's worked well in Taranaki, she said, but that's not to say it would work well if it went somewhere else. And I think that's a fair point.
In your view,
and
Minister,
that's what we're having a look
why
at.
do you think fracking is so polarising? Because whenever I'm discussing this on Talkback, a lot of intelligent debate on both sides, to be fair. But what I'm sensing is people are wary of fracking.
Yeah. Look, fracking has kind of got almost this mythical thing about it now. People hear the word, they don't really necessarily understand it, but it worries them. Fundamentally, there's 3 concerns. The first is some people are worried that it causes earthquakes, and I've got to say that all the evidence I've seen suggests that, well, yes, at a very, very minor level, but no more so than a heavy truck rolling down the road. So yes, there can be some low-level movement, but nothing that anyone, and Joan Wright has acknowledged that is of a particularly serious level. The second one is around the discharge of the fracking fluids and how they're properly handled afterwards.
All the chemicals that go
involved. Well, actually, the chemicals are not terribly. So the chemicals used in New Zealand are different to some of those very nasty ones that were used in the States, and they saw in that Gasland documentary. But still, they have to be properly handled.
Did you see the Gasland documentary?
I haven't seen it, but I've seen excerpts from it.
So have I.
Yeah. But very, very different chemicals used in the States.
All right.
And then the third one is whether there's any risk for aquifer pollution as they drill down through the aquifers. All of those are valid. All of them, I think, can be properly managed with good regulatory frameworks. And this has been happening in New Zealand for 40 years, and they've never had an incident. That's not to say we don't have to be careful. And I support that our frameworks have to keep pace. And so we're certainly having a good work through Dr. Wright's recommendations.
Do you understand, though, but there's the concern of the expansion of fracking. And the concern is that expansion is just as bad as far as some of the greenies are concerned as doing it right now.
Yeah,
or is it an unwarranted argument?
There's been no problem to date, so doing more of it in and of itself isn't bad. What matters is where it's done well, and that's certainly what we would agree with. We have to ensure that the well casings are safe, that the water aquifers are protected, that there's proper handling of the chemicals. I think all of those are very reasonable things to measure and ensure our frameworks do.
She said the current regulations are not adequate. What did you take from that?
Well, what I took from it was exactly what she went on to say in her report, which is that they're not adequate for it to then expand greatly across the rest of New Zealand. So the current regulations...
So she's not talking specifically about the practices of fracking then?
I understand her report to be very clear to say that she's happy with the way it is working, that there isn't an incidence, but she thinks it does have to be looked at more carefully before it expands at the rate it could. That's a reasonable point, and we're working with we've just actually recently put out some national guidelines on hydraulic fracturing to deal with some of that, which I think are working very well and being well received. But it's something you have to keep a watching brief on.
We need to take a quick break. When we return, Silver Fern Farms wanting to dump its crap in the Waimakariri River. That's next. Stay with us. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. My guest tonight is Environment Minister Amy Adams. Minister, Silver Fern Farms, they want to dump treated wastewater, perhaps it's treated, into the Waimakariri River. This is not going down well with locals. Surely in the 21st century we shouldn't be even doing this or considering this. Yeah. My understanding is they've done it before. They can't send it to Bromley because Bromley's at capacity. What do you see in this?
Look, I think that there's very genuine reasons people are concerned. I don't like to think that any river in New Zealand is treated as a dumping ground for anything. I think we as a community and as a country would like to think that we're well past the days of using our rivers as wastewater pipes. And I understand that what Silver Fern Farms is talking about is in the situations where the system can't otherwise handle it as a backstop measure. But I don't think it's in a long-term setting that it's really viable for us to continue to use our rivers like that. Now, obviously, I don't know the details of the specific application. It's something they're working through with the councils. I haven't read through all the briefings and the information, so I have to be very careful in commenting on the specifics. But I can understand the community's concern. These are our rivers. They're at the heart of Canterbury, the Waimak, the Rakaia. They're who we are. And I don't like the thought of potentially nasties going into the river because there's not a better alternative somewhere. We've got to think beyond that. Will these new government
regulations help then? Is there anything, because that's,
yeah. So what our regulations do is tell the councils how they have to set their plans and their standards. But what it does say to the council is it's no defence just to say something has a consent. A contaminant going into the river is a contaminant going into the river, whether it's under a consent or not.
So surely in the Waimak Council, I suppose in this case it's Environment Canterbury, isn't it? Surely they can just decline it then. Problem solved. They've had 300 submissions as a result of last Monday, all against it by all accounts. Surely common sense will prevail, don't you think?
Well, you'd like to think common sense always prevailed. I can't obviously prejudge it for them, but obviously they are the decision makers. They will make the decision whether it's the appropriate use, and the community obviously will have a view on whether that's right or not. But as I said, I think there's very real reasons why the community is concerned when our rivers are treated like a backstop dumping ground.
What are your thoughts on returning democracy to Environment Canterbury? I know there's different ministers responsible. You've got your local government minister, Paula Bennett, you've got yourself as the Environment Minister, Conservation Minister, whatever. But there is a real sense it's time now to return democracy to ECAN. Yeah. What do you see in that?
So at the moment, the way the legislation is set up, the Commissioner's term expires in 2016. So at the next local body elections, the way things stand, they vanish into the night and the community goes back to fully
Will they, do you
electing a
think?
council. Well, interestingly enough, the legislation has a provision in it that says that Minister Bennett, as local government minister, and myself have to conduct a review, and that's underway now to say, well, actually, is it sensible just to have a drop-dead date and a brand new lot come in and pick up the reins?
And what do you think?
Well, at the moment, I think that there are some serious issues around transition that need to be considered. I think some really good progress has been made with ECAN over the last 6 years, and I think it was a challenging situation to come into anyway, and then the earthquakes made it even more complex. I think some really good momentum has been picked up, and I wouldn't like to see that lost. So I think we have to think carefully about how we transition away from commissioners and back to elected representatives to ensure that we keep that momentum and the learnings in place. But the process we're going to go through is there'll be a period that we're working through at the moment where we're talking to the mayoral forum members, where we're talking to Ngāi Tahu, where we're talking to the commissioners, getting a sense from them of some of the issues they want us to consider. Then we're going to be putting out a discussion document to ask the public what they think. We were originally going to put that out this year, but actually the decision we made was, look, there's an election coming up, and whoever the new government is should really get to make the final decision about what goes into that. They'll be the ones making the decision. So if we put the document out now, it will be the new government who makes the decision. So I think that the new government can come in and format that discussion document, have the conversation with the public, and then see if we need to have some transitional
I might be wrong about
arrangements.
this, but I don't know, is there a perception, do you think, that it's steady as she goes at the moment, that the commissioners are actually doing okay because it's their line of work in the first place? You haven't got people that want to be on the boards of everything for the sake of it, running it, because essentially that's what happened in the start, wasn't it? There was too much dysfunction,
Well, look,
and now you've got commissioners that seem to be doing okay. I mean, that's the feedback I'm getting. Could be wrong in some accounts.
And look, there'll always be instances where people disagree with that decision or this decision, but certainly the feedback I get is that actually people think it's running a lot better now than it was, and I think that's a good thing. And I do think it's important we look back and say, well, how do we make sure we don't end up back where we were? There's a number of issues around that. I mean, ECAN is a huge catchment geographically, but very heavily population-based in Christchurch. So you get situations where a group of people from Christchurch City are making decisions that affect what happens in the Mackenzie country or in Chertsey or in Ashburton, and there's a real disconnect felt by those communities as to whether they're properly heard and represented. So there's a number of things we have to think about.
How much communication do you have with ECAN commissioners as Environment Minister?
So they report to us against the effectively letter of expectations that was set for them around what they were expected to do, which is manage the Canterbury water management strategy, deal with regional transport, those sorts of issues. They report to us, I think, once a quarter. Just tell us how they're getting on. It's a very straightforward.
And how do you rate their performance then?
Actually, very well. As I said, I have issues that on case by case, I might not necessarily agree with this decision or that. Probably every Cantabrian does. But as an organisation, one of the things that I've really respected of them is they have really restored a good working relationship with all of the other councils. Remember, when we originally sacked the ECAN councillors, we had every single one of the 10 councils in Canterbury writing to the government asking for us to sack them. That's how bad things have got. Every single mayor in Christchurch or in the Canterbury region wrote to the government and called for them to be sacked. Relationships had completely broken down. ECAN and Christchurch City Council sued each other more than they did anything else. Ngāi Tahu didn't feel involved at all. And now all of those groups are saying they've got a really good comprehensive, cohesive working relationship with them. So that's a good start.
But you still want to see some kind of democracy return in
absolutely.
2016?
Look, I don't see the commissioners as a long-term strategy. I never have.
Okay.
But I do think we just have to look at that transition issue carefully.
Amy Adams, the mum, the politician. There have been some whispers, I suppose you should say, on the political landscape in Christchurch. Any prime ministerial aspirations, Amy Adams?
No, look, I look at the job that John Key does, I look at the hours he works, and it just staggers me. I love what I do. I hope I get the chance to do it for a little longer. But to be honest, stepping up to be Prime Minister is a tenfold increase again, and I see the time that it takes me away from my family, the time it takes me away from my husband. I don't regret it. I think it's an incredible privilege to have the job I have, but Prime Minister is another step up again, and someone like John Key is a rare breed. He does it brilliantly. I'm not sure that I'm cut out for it.
How long do you want to be in politics for?
It's not up to me, it's up to the voters. But from my perspective, it comes down to as long as I have the passion for what I'm doing. It's a tough job. We get a lot of heat, we get a lot of criticism. Sometimes you know
Facebook
you're doing well.
trolls?
Oh, absolutely. Death threats, the whole lot. So you
Death threats?
Oh, occasionally, yeah. Yeah.
Over what?
Oh, sorts of random things. Sometimes the first one I had was because Wins wouldn't buy some chap a washing machine. And so he several times threatened
Clearly
to
you're
kill
to
me.
blame.
Clearly I'm to blame. I'm the man, I'm the government.
That's where the death threat, isn't it?
But no, I've had a few. I've had bullets sent to me with my name engraved on them. I've had all sorts of things. But the...
Really?
Yeah.
Bullets sent to you with your name engraved on it?
But people are pretty... Most people are good. But it's a tough job. As I said, I think it's an incredible privilege to have the chance to do it. And as long as I can let the bad stuff wash off me and keep focused on doing what we think is the right thing for New Zealand, and I have the passion for it, then I think it's an incredible privilege to have the chance.
Environment Minister Amy Adams, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on to Lynched. That's our show this week. Have a fantastic week. We'll catch you back next week.